Well, good morning and welcome to the latest installment of Scholars Forum on PatristiCast. I'm your host, John Solheid. Today I am very delighted to welcome Dr. George Karamanolis. He's Associate Professor of Ancient Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna, Austria. He has written and edited several books, including Plato and Aristotle in Agreement, Studies on Porphyry, the Aporetic Tradition in Ancient Philosophy, and Pseudo-Aristotle's De Mundo. But today, we're going to talk about the second edition of his book, The Philosophy of Early Christianity, the second edition published in 2021?
Yes.
2021 indeed, Routledge Press. Dr. Karamanolis, welcome to PatristiCast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the invitation.
So before we get started, I wanted to ask you, what's the weather like over there in Vienna right now?
It was snowing a couple of hours ago. It was snowing. It was freezing because I ride my bicycle to come to work, so it was freezing cold. Now it's a little bit better. It's no snowing anymore.
What's the rough temperature? It'll make sense once I kind of get to the point.
I think it is 2 degrees Celsius right now, but
okay.
It falls under zero during the night.
Okay. So here, I'm in central Minnesota, St. Cloud, and when I woke up this morning, it was 15 below zero Fahrenheit.
A
wind chill of 28 below, I think. So Celsius, I think right now it's probably about 24 or 25 below. So we're in a deep freeze right now.
I sympathize with you.
I would take 2 below Celsius any day right now. That would be pretty good. It's quite cold here.
So I don't really don't get embarrassed with 2 degrees minus, right? So that is
no.
spring for you, right? Okay.
That's right. That would be a heat wave. So your book now, they tuned in not to listen to us talk about the weather, but your book, The Philosophy of Early Christianity. So in your introduction, you highlight a tension that is kind of a theme throughout your book, and that is this notion of, can we even talk about early Christianity as a philosophy? The philosophers of antiquity didn't think of Christianity as one. Even some Christians didn't think of Christianity as a philosophy. So can you talk a little bit about that tension and how that tension plays in your book?
Right. Well, this is really the gist of the matter. This is a very important issue, and I think this needs to be addressed in the beginning of any sort of discussion about the philosophy of early Christianity, namely to what extent, if at all, these sort of intellectuals can count as philosophers, whether there is such a thing as philosophy of early Christianity, and so on. Well, I think it is quite clear that a number of intellectuals, of early Christian intellectuals like Justin Martyr, Clement, Tertullian, Origen, Basil, Gregory, deal with philosophical questions. So I think that is sort of undisputed. They somehow set out to, and they do address philosophical questions in different ways, right? So they take positions on philosophical issues, and these issues, most of them, come from the philosophical tradition, the standard philosophical tradition of antiquity, namely the soul-body problem, sort of the free will issue, the sort of how the world has come about, what are the principles of the world, how shall we explain knowledge, what counts as knowledge, how the human intellect works, what counts as happiness, and so on. So there is a set, by that time, namely late antiquity, 2nd century AD, ancient philosophy or philosophy has sort of some very clear, recognizable questions, and all philosophers sort of set out to address them. And the question then is whether dealing with these questions makes you a philosopher.
Yes.
And the answer is clearly no. So not anyone who addresses these questions or touches upon these questions or discusses these questions is automatically or should automatically qualify as a philosopher. I think what is important, at least in the way we know philosophy in the ancient world, and that is exactly what we have somehow inherited in the modern world, in sort of nowadays, even in the sort of Western tradition at least, is that philosophy has a certain methodology, has a way of coming about these questions. So that is, I think, important, namely how you go about these questions. For instance, you mentioned one of the books I edited, the Aporetic tradition. In antiquity, starting with Plato, basically with Socrates, there is a very strong tradition in inquiring aporetically. What does this mean? Namely, you spend quite a lot of energy to somehow determine the question and somehow set out to distinguish the options, the ways you can go about it. Namely, there's a certain number of ways of going about a certain philosophical issue, and you should somehow map out the possibilities, right? And see which way is more promising and why. So this aporetic way is established in antiquity. It distinguishes somehow aporetic philosophers like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, the skeptics, from dogmatists like the Stoics and the Epicureans. And it is important that we do find this aporetic tradition also in the early Christian philosophers, namely Origen, for instance, or Gregory of Nyssa, for instance, very often do not know which way to go. And they somehow admit that. Namely, they say, look, there is no clear answer in our tradition. We need to find out. So this shows two things. It shows that people somehow recognize that the tradition, namely whatever you call it, namely the what has become the New Testament, because at the time there was no New Testament, but anyway, the writings of what has become New Testament or the Bible or all these writings, of course, had an authority. But people understand that no matter what the authority of these writings is, they do not really set light on philosophical questions like what counts as free will, in what sense are we free, so how we should explain concepts, and so on, right? So however authoritative sort of the Gospels are, they do not really have anything to contribute on this issue. So the one question is, why do you need to find out about all this? But clearly, I will come back to that. Early Christian intellectuals want to take positions on these matters. So if they want to do that, then the way is the way of ancient philosophy. Namely, you map out the options, you assess arguments, and you try to weight the different arguments and the different positions and see which one sounds more plausible and why. So I think that this is pretty philosophical. I'm not claiming that all of those are like that. So I wouldn't say that Tertullian is sort of a philosopher in the same way that Origen or Gregory of Nyssa is. It is very clear to me that Origen is a philosopher, is not just a philosophical mind, but is a philosopher, and I can somehow explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So all of them have a philosophical education. They know about philosophical positions. They know about the philosophical issues, but not all of them, in my view, could qualify as philosophers. Some of them do, and some others perhaps have philosophical views, but they are not really philosophers in the sort of strict sense of the word.
So you brought up a couple of different issues there that I'd like to highlight a little bit more. So Tertullian, for example, is such an interesting figure, very colorful in his rhetoric, and as you say, educated, has a good philosophical education. And you note here in your book his rhetorical question: what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What does the academy have to do with the church? And his point there seems to be, that philosophy has dangers for the Christian. And he kind of says something to the effect of, if you have faith, you don't really need to search out answers. If you are trying to do so, that means your faith probably isn't very strong. Yet, as you note, philosophy is all over in his works. But that question kind of gets at a very kind of famous criticism of Christianity that even exists today. That is, you can't really be philosophers because you have this Bible that you say is true, right, and yet you don't try to demonstrate anything with it. You just take it on faith. There's right, no attempt to construct an argument. And your whole point here, I think, in the introduction and in the first chapter, is that Christians debated the biblical text because it doesn't provide explicit answers to all questions.
Absolutely.
They did construct a methodology, just like in the first and second centuries, the Platonists were debating the Timaeus, which didn't answer every question. So they kind of flip the script and say, well, yes, we have faith, but we're not much different from you guys who have faith in your own authoritative text. Can you say a little bit more about that? That's a key issue.
Yes, I think that is definitely a key issue. Well, as you said, we'll take the Timaeus and let's move to the Platonist camp. So the Timaeus is is a crucial dialogue for every single Platonist in late antiquity, namely from Plutarch onwards. The Timaeus somehow is a basic text on which people, Platonists, craft their metaphysics, their cosmology, their theology, their soul theory, their ethics, right? So, but how shall we explain how shall we explain the Timaeus? What is the right interpretation? There's a number of options. Mm-hmm. So let's say that Plato is an authority and Plato has right. So what has he right about? Mm-hmm. Namely, what is the position that we want to credit him? It's unclear. Yeah. So the way it works is that the following, namely Platonists somehow philosophize in the following way, namely they want to find the interpretation of Timaeus on issue X, like the soul body or the nature of the soul or the way the world has come about and so on. They want to find a position that is so strong and plausible mm-hmm. that can be vindicated and defended and can stand to argument. And when they find such a position that can stand to argument, it can be vindicated against all possible objections, then they say, aha, this should be the position that Plato wanted, because, well, after all, Plato is a superb philosopher, is an authority. So it is not that they know which position Plato defends. Mm-hmm. They want philosophically to find a philosophically a plausible, strong position. And then, exactly because it is such a strong position, it somehow it can be attributed to Plato. It is worth of Plato. Mm-hmm. So similarly, it works, I think, to some extent with early Christians. Mm-hmm. So they are completely open as to what the nature of the soul is.
Yes. So, okay, a couple things. So the Timaeus, I guess we should clarify, that's Plato's dialogue on creation. And it's where you get Plato's his doctrine on God, for example. And you note in here, so one Celsus, who is a 2nd century philosopher, attacks Christianity on this ground that you guys are just anti-intellectuals. You have this faith, but you don't demonstrate anything. Absolutely. And Origen kind of flips the script and says, well, so do you guys. And he alludes to the fact that Platonists can agree on Plato, and it never gets resolved. You can talk about demonstration all you want, but you guys are just as divided as we are.
Right. Yes, that's exactly the reason why Origen somehow engages with Celsus. While Origen lives in the 3rd century, and Celsus, end of sort of 2nd century, but his argument was so powerful and a threat to Christianity, namely the point, which we find also in Galen, in other ancient philosophers, namely pagan philosophers like Galen, like Porphyry, also people like Lucian, that you guys do not really abide with the pagan tradition of arguing and finding out through argument. You are led, you are guided by faith. Mm-hmm. So I think they want to somehow to address and disarm this argument. And one way of trying to disarm this argument is by showing that a Platonist like Celsus also relies on a certain interpretation of Plato. It is a subject, what he attributes to Plato is a subject of interpretation. And other Platonists, like, for instance, Origen's contemporaries, like Plotinus and Porphyry, disagree with Celsus. So is it actually Celsus' interpretation the best possible interpretation of Plato? Well, Origen would say no. If that is the case, then Celsus does not really count as a good philosopher. So at the end, what they want to show is that, well, one thing that philosophy and philosophers do at that time is that they interpret, they do exegetical work, right? So you have texts and you go about them exegetically. You try to see which interpretation is sort of the best interpretation. That is what Alexander of Aphrodisias does, what the Platonists do with the Timaeus, what the Christians do, and so on. So all of them, to a certain extent, are exegetes, interpreters, right? So then there are certain standards by which we judge interpretation, namely which interpretation is more plausible or more philosophically sophisticated, and so on. Then if that is the case, then we're all on the same boat.
So then going on to the methodology section, which you say is so important in the definition of what it is to do philosophy.
Yep.
You talk about this aporetic tradition, this notion of finding things that are omitted or things that are left unanswered in a text, for example, and then you work out different hypotheses to see which one is the strongest. And that seems to be exactly what Origen does in the preface to On First Principles, where he outlines what is essentially an early version of the creed. It's the rule of faith. And he says, but it doesn't answer all these questions. It's left up for us to do that. So how did early Christians, not just Origen, but Origen was a main one, a huge figure in this regard, how do early Christians go about establishing a methodology for determining what is the most accurate or truthful interpretation?
Right. Well, I think that's a very sort of crucial question. But let me say, before I sort of set out to answer the question, let me say one thing about sort of the different options that Christians have open to them. And that sort of is a historical fact. There is sort of so much disagreement and strife among early Christians about every possible issue. So Christianity is a very multifaceted and sort of open movement. You find all possible sort of kinds of disagreement between sort of, if you take Justin and Tertullian and Origen and Gregory of Nyssa, and then the Gnostics of this or the other kind, there is sort of course, there might be some issues they agree on, but there is also so much disagreement. So if faith or authority could establish sort of a position or a philosophical problem, there wouldn't have been such disagreement, clearly. All right, so let's go back to what your question. So how then can we work sort of a philosophical answer or work out a philosophical position? I think there are sort of various factors that here play a role. Namely, these people are philosophically very smart and very educated. They were following the ancient debates, so they could see the dead ends of some debates, right? So for instance, the monism versus dualism tradition in Platonism, right? Both ways have their own problems and dead ends, right? So they know which dead ends are worse. So they know what they want to avoid, right? They basically, to put it otherwise, that is, I think, what we do in philosophy. We want certain problems and we do not want others. So we somehow we are free to pick up the difficulties we want to deal with. Other difficulties may be difficult to manage, or impossible to manage. So Origen, for instance, Gregory of Nyssa, for instance, are aware of the difficulties of the Platonist tradition, sort of say, direction dualism, and they somehow go the other way, right? So people sometimes say, look, they are eclectics, because why? Because sort of they, on this point, they side with the Stoics, and on that point, they side with Plato, and on that point, they side with Aristotle. But this is not really the case. They are very creative in the following sense. They see where the traditions are sort of problematic, and they try to avoid the dead ends which they want to deal with. So in that sense, they need at the end to produce a new sum of answers, or if you want to call it like that, a system, right? And I think that is what Origen and Gregory of Nyssa very clearly, to my mind, set out to do. Namely, they are aware of the fact that your answer on issue A bears on the answer on issue B, and on the issue C, and on the issue D. So you need to see that. You need to be aware of that and work your way very carefully. Not everyone is like that. A Tertullian is not exactly like that. A Clement of Alexandria is not exactly like that. But Origen, I think, is somebody who is sort of, forgive me the word, systematic in some sense, right? So he knows that this position may solve you a problem, but it also has repercussions. And you need to somehow see them. What does this mean for sort of other questions in philosophy? And I think that is a sign that philosophy matures in Christianity. For instance, the question of matter. What is matter?
Yes.
What is matter? So you cannot really say, okay, we want to avoid the dualist tradition. We don't want to have God and matter. We don't want to have two principles for all kinds of reasons. Why? Because if we have God and matter, then the second principle, matter, somehow makes God inferior, or is antagonistic with God, or constrains the freedom of God, and so on. There are several arguments against that view. We don't want that dualism, all right? So, but you need also to address the question: what if you say that God created matter in order to avoid the dualist position? You also need to say at the end what counts as matter, what is matter, because in the world there is no matter, there are material objects, right? So what do you understand as matter? We find this sort of a sketch of an answer in Origen, and then in Gregory of Nyssa we have a theory of matter. So that also shows that sort of that Christianity also grows sort of philosophically. There is a way it goes.
So let me just kind of summarize and make sure I understand the point correctly here, because you bring up what is another central theme running throughout your book, and that is this notion of principles.
Absolutely.
And matter. Is matter a principle? And so arche, principle, can also mean like beginning. One of the problems with Plato's Timaeus is it's not entirely clear. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, I don't know, but whether God is the sole principle and the cause of all creation, or whether there was a pre-existing matter that existed along with God, and from which God created the world. Now, a problem as you articulate it in this book is that if the latter were the case, if God and matter were co-principles, for example, then that would put constraints on God's freedom. So creation would come about by necessity, not God's freely choosing. On the other hand, if you deny matter as a principle and you have God as the sole principle, how do you account for the problem of evil in the world, for example? So this is kind of an example of, you got positions, and then each position isn't really a perfect solution because it comes with other problems. Is that accurate?
That is exactly the case. That is exactly the issue. Namely, but it takes some time to somehow see the spectrum of problems in front of you, because then in the beginning, I think people deal with sort of issues piecemeal, with this and that and the other, and but then they realize that they are all connected. Namely, in the Timaeus, for instance, a number of problems are so closely connected. One thing that is clear in the Timaeus, one of the few things that is clear, is that matter, or whatever sort of the receptacle, is a principle independent of God. So we have at least sort of, if you want, 2 or 3 principles. This is also open, but at least there are 2 independent principles, namely God and the receptacle, right? So the receptacle was interpreted since Aristotle and by the Platonists in late antiquity as equivalent to matter. So you have, in a way, 2 principles, right? So the Christians do take the Timaeus as a sort of a model. Why? Because you have sort of a creator God, but creator in a certain sense. So creator in the sense that it is not really sort of appealing to Christians of the second generation, namely to sort of Christians of the 3rd century, because they cannot really, they do not really like the idea that there is something that contributes to the creation, namely plays a role as a principle, and sort of God is only, say, a craftsman, right? No. So that's as we said, that imposes constraints on the creator. But then how then shall we go the other way? Because at least matter, as you said, accounts or can possibly qualify as a principle of evil, right? So, and you have all these issues open in Plotinus, right? So Plotinus needs to somehow make maneuvers in order to somehow deal at the same time with cosmology, ontology, or the issue of free will, the issue of evil. You find exactly this sort of attitude also in Origen. So what Origen does is he tries to somehow disconnect sort of the issue of free will from cosmogony, right? But not from cosmology, namely sort of humans are understood as sort of as created intellects, right? So, but his point is that the evil comes about in the world only from one source, namely from man, right? So that is a Stoic position, basically.
Yes.
So although Origen is, to a large extent, a Platonist, on that matter, he leaves aside Platonism, and he's somehow sees that the Stoics have an argument that somehow fits to Christianity. Is that eclecticism? I would say that is philosophically sort of philosophical sophistication rather than eclecticism.
So faced with 2 different options here, the dualism, as you put it, God and matter are the principles of creation, or just God, the monism. Christians, by and large, seem to reject the former, the dualism, with the exception of certain Gnostic groups. But that accounts for, perhaps, that helps them to explain perhaps how evil, the existence of evil, resides in the human intellect, in man, but it doesn't really address how the disorder and the chaos in the world can be explained, and why certain people are born into worse circumstances than others. Now, Origen uses this as he doesn't really find a better alternative explanation than the pre-existence of the soul. We're born into certain circumstances because of some prior choice we made in a previous existence. But all of this just points to the fact, as you rightly point out, these Christian intellectuals weren't like mice following the Pied Piper. Just because one smart person says it, they don't all believe it. There's a great deal of debate. So can you talk in your book, you bring up a number of different intellectuals. Can you say a little bit about how perhaps Origen's attempt or Clement's attempt differs from Tertullian or Irenaeus? Because there's multiple attempts to explain these phenomena.
Right. I think in the 2nd century, and also to some extent also in the beginning of the 3rd century, I'm not a historian, but my understanding is, because this is really a field, which is really a huge field, namely Gnosticism, and also parallel phenomena like Hermeticism and so on. But it is clear that at that age, namely at the age in which Irenaeus writes, or Tertullian writes, or Clement writes, Christians, want somehow to preclude certain sort of philosophical positions. Like, for instance, one that is somehow they find terribly annoying is that the creator is evil, right? So they want to put those sort of positions aside. And what we find in Irenaeus, for instance, is a philosophical argument against sort of the dualism of the various Gnostic kinds. But we do and that is, of course, a philosophical position and a philosophical argument. But he is not philosophically minded in the way that Origen is, namely to somehow explain in detail what exactly the right position is and how it connects with other issues. Namely, there is evil in the world. Well, of course, there is a question of what you understand as evil, but there's badness in the world. However you call it, there are accidents and deaths and poverty and so on. The problem of theodicy, right? The Gnostic position is faulty, or the Gnostic positions are problematic. Okay, but how shall we somehow account for that? You don't find a theory in Irenaeus. You find perhaps some points here and there, but basically he is somehow very deeply engaged in polemic. He's very sharp, but we know that, also orators and sophists were very sharp, but they do not really have a philosophical theory at the end. Of course, no philosophical theory is waterproof, but at least you need somehow to make a step forward and try to overcome both the aporia, the polemic, the heuristic, and expose yourself, right? So that is what we find in Origen. Namely, his position is not really ideal, perhaps, but it is sort of an interesting philosophical position. We find then, next generations, the following generations, somehow take over from that. Yep. So the discussion, Justin and Clement, is sort of ancient history for people like Gregory of Nyssa and Basil, right? So of course they criticize sometimes, or they somehow they set themselves in dialogue with Origen, and they do not accept all of his views, but they have a new basis, right, on which they discuss things, which is Origen, exactly because he somehow took positions on certain matters, and that is what Irenaeus, for instance, or Clement did not do very clearly. So this polemical, apologetic tendency in early Christianity is slowly in the 3rd century overcome, and people see the need to not only rule out and fend off objections and positions and arguments, but also to produce a positive account, so to speak, right? That's sort of basically what we also have in a way in Plato, namely we have the aporetic Plato, and of course we learn a lot about the aporetic methodology and the Socratic dialectic, but at the end we also need some kind of account or a theory about what the soul is or what virtue is, right? And that is of course difficult, right?
So Origen, for example, he in On First Principles, when he's discussing matter, he provides a very precise definition of matter. So one of an aspect of Origen's methodology is a precise definition of terms to make sure that his readers and his listeners are kind of on the same page with what he's doing. You know, one of the things I think about here, so I'm more of a historian than I am a philosopher. And you mentioned that Origen does this stuff. He tests different hypotheses.
Yes.
But the other ones don't. And it gets me thinking historically, what were the contexts which allowed Origen to do that and not someone like Irenaeus? And I just can't help but think it has something to do with the fact that Origen is teaching in a school of philosophy, much like Plotinus, so they had the leisure to do all these things when they're producing their texts. But that's just my little diatribe there. We'll leave that aside for now. But I do think it's an interesting historical question how Origen, because when you read his commentaries, this is all over in his biblical commentaries, where he will present an aporia. So there's a problem with this biblical passage. It leaves questions unanswered. And then he goes about and he tests like 3 or 4 different hypotheses, sometimes not even giving his own or coming up with a certain conclusion. He just leaves them as possibilities.
Right. I think it is terribly important that he is not really afraid of admitting the aporia or the sort of the lack of answer.
Yeah.
We need now to craft an answer.
Yeah.
We can be confident that we will find an answer. I think that is the spirit of philosophy in antiquity, and it is important that sort of Christianity, it's somehow, to put it the other way around, it is indicative in a way of how strong philosophy is in antiquity, that Christianity models itself on it. So, but they could have said, look, we don't really care about all these issues. We simply don't care. We are sort of have a religion like sort of, I don't know, Mithra.
Yes.
What are the views of the Mithras? We don't know. We find Mithraea here and there, in the Roman, in Britain, around the Roman Empire. What did these people believe? It's very unclear, right? It's also clearly Mithraism was not a philosophy, so they didn't bother about it. Was a religion, as far as I know, mostly sort of Roman soldiers. So Christianity did not say that. Namely, we do not really care about your views. Our views are the right ones. No, they set themselves in dialogue with the Stoics, with the Epicureans, with the skeptics, with Platonists, with Aristotelians, and they try to convince. Once you start this battle, you somehow understand or you admit that you will be judged by this criteria, namely you belong to that tradition. So they are guided by that tradition. And I think that's important, that Christianity from the beginning becomes philosophical, namely it is guided by what philosophy is in antiquity, in pagan antiquity. And I think that has repercussions for the whole physiognomy of Christianity. Christianity is not just a religion, has sort of a strong philosophical side, and that from the very beginning.
So that's I want to close this conversation later, picking up on that very point. But one thing, so you talk about theories, developing a theory for things.
Yep.
And a very important issue for Christians was this notion of free will. Because Christianity has this doctrine that, people Some people go to heaven, some people don't. So, how do we account for this? Origen, in book 3 of On First Principles, gets at this very much, and here's where he dives into Stoicism and the Stoics' understanding of how different beings get their movement.
Right.
It's one of the most fascinating texts, I think, in all of Christian late antiquity. Can you say a little bit more about not just book 3 of First Principles, but how do early Christians go about formulating a system or a theory of free will that defends, on the one hand, God's goodness, also human responsibility, because it gets into ethics too?
Yeah, I think they realize, and I think that is, again, indicative of their sort of philosophical mind, that they understand that they need to start from very low, from bottom up, namely to first to argue what counts as agency, right? What are the actions that count as my actions, right? So they start from that sort of issue, namely which actions count as my actions. That is an issue we find already in Plato and in Aristotle. In Aristotle, book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics, the first thing is that he wants to somehow address is the limits of the so-called voluntary and involuntary, right? So that is a philosophical, sort of a big philosophical issue. What counts as voluntary? So and then what are the causes of the voluntary, right? It might be the environment, it might be my desires. Is it then the case that I find myself having some desires? Namely, all humans have certain desires. Is it somehow the fault of our nature, so to speak, that we have certain desires, namely the desire for a good job or for food? We all find ourselves having such desires. Can we blame our desires, namely basically our human nature? Can we blame in a way the Creator that made us? He made us in such a way that we find somehow trapped in desires. And then the way up from that is no, because you can, the whole thing is about how you deal with your desires and how you assent or not assent.
Yes. That's a key concept in your chapter.
That is a key concept, right? The assent, that is a Stoic concept. That is a concept that they somehow drag from Stoic epistemology. Namely, when I see something, I say to myself, or I can say to myself, this is the case or it is not, right? And that, of course, entails possible actions, right? If I see a danger in front of me and I assent that this is a danger, that will trigger a certain action, right? So it is it's an entire theory of knowledge in the background, which they take over, and also a theory of the soul that partly take over, and they fit together. So Origen's theory of soul is not Stoic, but his epistemology is or theory of knowledge is to some extent Stoic, and he finds a way to craft this together. So if you take Tertullian, for instance, Tertullian sides with the Stoics on the nature of the soul. For Tertullian, the soul is a material entity, because he obviously read Stoic books and Stoic physicians. That was the science of his time, and he finds it plausible that the human soul is a material entity, because we have also our body reacts in a material way when we get ashamed, when we get afraid. We have sort of bodily reactions that are triggered by our soul. So he takes a certain position that he finds in the Stoics. Well, Origen takes over from the Stoics a view that he finds sort of plausible, without taking sort of their theory of soul. So assenting to a view somehow brings sort of the blame to you 100%, right? So that it cannot possibly be the impression, and I think that's sort of the word. It's a technical term that the Stoics have, namely that is what Cicero translated as impressio, the Greek antiposis.
Okay.
The Greek antiposis, namely impressio, something comes up to you, right? So you are hungry and there is a cake in front of you, and basically you cannot resist. But of course you can. The cake can never somehow automatically trigger assent. It doesn't matter how hungry or thirsty or whatever you are, no action can be triggered without your assent. And assent is sort of irrational sort of action, a mental act. So if that is the case, then humans are accountable and not God for the way he made us.
Or some kind of external cause like astral determinism, for example.
Right, exactly.
That's one of these appealing alternatives is, the stars determine our actions. So in book 3 of On First Principles, Origen spells this out where he says it's like a spider, when a spider has an image, and I think the term he uses there is fantasia, if I'm not mistaken, of a web and of weaving a web. It weaves it automatically. It's driven by an impulse to weave it. Whereas rational beings, the human being, for example, receives this image, or I think, what was the word you used for this? Not the image, but you used a different impression. Yes. But the human being, unlike the spider, has the ability to use reason, logos, to determine what's right or what's wrong before proceeding to act. And here's where I think we see a great convergence of the Bible, the biblical worldview, and the Hellenistic worldview, because he uses the term hegemonikon here.
Exactly.
It's happening in the governing faculty of the human being. And he links that concept, the hegemonikon, with the biblical concept of heart. So we see kind of like a convergence of cultures here, don't we?
Yes, that is true. But I completely agree. But it is first that they have this particular philosophical view, people like Origen and later Gregory of Nyssa, that they then show to us, there is actually agreement between the pagan view and the biblical view. Yes. It is exactly because, they first take sort of the philosophical view that they find plausible, and then they say, look, it's obvious, there's agreement here, there is so much evidence. But the work they have done in the background is a sort of philosophical work 100%.
Yes.
And then they want to somehow say, to appeal on authority or on the biblical text and so on. But that, I think, that is rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. So Tertullian's view, Tertullian understood the soul to be a product of the male seed, sperm, if I'm not mistaken. And that's how he kind of understood the soul to be matter. Whereas like the Alexandrian tradition it's an intellectual substance, it's an intelligible substance, it's intelligent matter. Substance. Yeah. What kind of implications would those arguments have for ethics and human behavior?
Enormous implications, because one thing that Tertullian wanted, clearly, he also was smart enough to understand that this position on human soul bears on sort of ethics and cosmology and so on. Namely, one thing that Tertullian wants to argue is that the mankind makes sort of a unity, and there is basically one soul that is transmitted. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It each one of us, namely to the extent that we are somehow descendants from, say, Adam and Eve, we are somehow sort of one mankind, one sort of group where there is a unity. We share sort of the same soul, the same human nature. That makes us all culpable, right? We somehow share the original sin, but it also makes us brothers, siblings, and sisters, right? It makes us sort of, we are not sort of individuals, we are sort of members of the mankind. So that has repercussions. And the other sort of implication is that if your soul is material, it can suffer or it can be rewarded, right? So then all of a sudden the rewards and punishments in afterlife can be seen in a new light. Well,
but
because
wouldn't someone like Origen respond though and say, well, if the soul is material, and Origen wants to maintain that the image of God that's spoken of in Genesis is the intellect, right. Wouldn't he say that would thereby lead by necessity to kind of an anthropomorphic view of God?
Yes, that absolutely, and he wants to somehow preserve for the human soul the ability to deliberate and decide, and that is possible only if the soul is sort of an intellectual, not just an intelligible entity, but basically an intellectual entity, an intellect, a mind, right? So for Platonists of that time, namely also for Plotinus, the soul is basically amounts to an intellect, not the soul that makes us living beings, so to speak. That is sort of the way that the soul extends to the body and enlivens the body. So through a dynamis, as they say, through a power, but the soul in its sort of original condition is an intellect or of an intellectual nature. And they find, of course, passages in Plato, well, in the Republic 10, that the soul is basically originally an intellect that which afterwards, when it sort of comes to a body, it is invested or with extra powers or with sort of, like, for instance, desires and affections in order to somehow deal with the body. So if there is an issue for all these people, namely Platonists and Christians alike, what the original nature of the soul is, right? Of course, we have we are living bodies, and the body, we are living beings because of a soul. But is that what the soul is, namely sort of circulate blood and make me thirsty or needy or tired and so on? No. This is what the soul does in the body, but this is not what the soul originally is. The soul originally is what makes me originally, namely, a thinking entity. That is what, for those people, a human being is a thinking entity, an entity that can think and decide and organize his or her life.
Okay, very good. So, okay, I want to end with two more questions.
Please.
And one is a question that we kind of got at earlier, and that is this notion of principles.
Yes.
And this dualist option or the monist option. And one question that we haven't really fleshed out yet is evil. So, because each one, the dualist and the monist, have implications for how we understand evil.
Right.
So Christians want to reject the dualist notion.
Right.
How do they go about justifying a sense of evil with their monist view? Because then one could argue then that God is responsible for evil if God is the sole principle of causation. Right.
I think on that, Origen is, of course, the leader, namely what evil is for Plotinus, for instance, who is a monist, right? Plotinus is a monist, so he rejects the dualist tradition. He doesn't want to have sort of a second principle. He wants to have a hierarchy of principles, but on the same line, namely oral divine principles. Matter is not a principle. So what matter is associated in Plotinus with evil, right? It's somehow responsible for badness in the world. And that, of course, is criticized later by Proclus. So Christians like Origen do not go along these lines, right? So Origen is a monist, but he does not really follow Plotinus, his colleague in the school of Ammonius, on that. The idea is sort of basically he follows the Stoic view. Namely, the Stoic view is that God has made us rational beings in the same sense that God is a rational being. Namely, we can create, recreate, the world. Namely, we do not really find ourselves in the world. We make the world, we shape the world according to our sort of decisions. We can decide how we want to act. In that sense, we are active, because the Stoics have this view of reason, namely everything is saved by reason, namely a tree, the sea, everything is saved by reason, and everything is sort of a rational entity, to the extent that God is shaping everything and makes it sort of have an identity. But humans are not just rational entities in that sense, namely shaped by God reason, but they also have the ability to shape the world further. Namely, they are active. They are active in the way that God is, right? They can shape their environment, and God does not interfere with that. Mm-hmm. So we have two sources of acting and active reason in the world: God and man, right? So of course, God somehow decides about what can happen eventually, right? But God never decides about what human beings would decide, right? Mm-hmm. Not, of course, all decisions are materialized, are realized, right? So that is sort of contingent. Mm-hmm. So what we are basically accountable for and responsible for is for our decisions, right? So that is what makes us basically good or bad, namely the kinds of decisions we make. Of course, we may want sort of to rob the bank, but we don't really find time to do that. That does not make us good, right? So we are bad people to the extent that we have such a bad desire, or we made such a bad decision. So that is, I think, for the Stoics and for Origen, what somehow brings evil into the world, namely deciding and thinking not according to virtue.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So this is basically a kind of thinking and a kind of deciding that is unfree. So you are free, not in the sense of sort of choosing between good and evil, but you are free, for the Stoics, only in the sense of being virtue enough, smart enough, philosophical enough, not to be tempted by the evil and to follow the good. Right. So I think that is a notion that the Christians take over, because it fits with their worldview. Namely, they don't want the Creator, God, to be accountable, to be responsible for badness in the world. So God somehow has his proxies, active intellects, active rational beings, men, who are free to decide.
Yeah, and this comes up in Contra Calcium, I think, is it book 4, I think, where
Yes.
Calcius asks, well, why didn't God just make human beings perfect in that sense?
Right.
And Origen in his answer seems to place some constraints even on God. He says, well, I don't even know if that's possible. But he says, even if it were possible, it would contradict the very definition of virtue. Because if we were compelled to do something against our will, if we were made a certain way, then we would have to get rid of the concept of virtue altogether.
Absolutely. Yeah, you are absolutely right. But on the other hand, they want to show that mankind is really on the top of the pyramid in the world that God created, right?
Yes.
So God is really man is really very close to God, right? Is like God in that sense. He is like God in that very sense. Man can decide and can shape the world around him and the environment around him and his family and so on, right? Only man can do that. So that is, of course, that comes at the cost you mentioned, right?
Yes.
But this is also a sense in which, very clear sense in which man is like God, in the likeness of God, right?
Yes. So, okay, good. We ended on a concept here, likeness to God, which Plato brings up.
Absolutely.
As like the end, the goal for mankind. It's got me thinking, it's something that you don't really address in your book, and it's more of a historical question, I guess. But your first chapter, you get into the concept of archy, and in the introduction, or is it no? The first chapter you bring up logos. The second chapter you bring up archy, principles.
Yes.
So logos and archy, then we've got image and likeness. I mean, it seems to me that one of the most significant events in history is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, because it would seem to me that would necessarily lead to Jewish and Christian intellectuals reading the Bible with philosophically laden terms. I don't know what you think of that. I mean, like the Gospel of John, the first verse, you got archy and logos in the very first verse.
I think you are absolutely right about that. That is one sort of important event in sort of the history, in the intellectual history, the translation of the Bible into Greek. I think the second was Philo's writings and Philo's interpretation of the Torah and the creation. Philo, and I'm not a Philo expert. I've read sort of several of his works, but I think I did not really pay as much attention to his contribution to the rise of this philosophical tradition I'm talking about as I should have. But he played an enormous role because he recognized sort of the importance of the pagan, call it, philosophical tradition, and he writes in Greek, of course, and he prepares the soil. So I think many of those guys, namely and Clement and Eusebius, clearly, Origen, they know of Philo's writings, and they draw on them from here and there. You see in the Preparatio Evangelica is full of quotations from Philo. Clearly, Philo was important to these people. I'm not in a position to completely assess. I think David Runia is sort of the guy who knows much about that. Namely, he's written about that, namely, not just about Philo, but how Philo informs this Christian philosophical tradition. But at any rate, all I wanted to say is that you are absolutely right about the translation of the Bible into Greek. I think the second big event is Philo, his contribution, because he makes Judaism sort of a member, or at least connected with the ancient philosophical tradition, and that is of enormous importance.
Yes. Yeah, Philo, of course, the first century Greek-speaking and writing Jewish intellectual in Alexandria, Egypt. For anybody interested in learning a little bit more about Philo, you can go to my previous PatristiCast episode with Mar and Niehoff. I would highly recommend it. So in Luke Acts, for example, now a lot of New Testament scholars don't really think Luke Acts is historically accurate. They think the author is reflecting things that are going on at his own time rather than things that are going on at the apostolic times. But in Luke Acts, you have Paul and Apollos debating with Stoics and Epicureans. So whether or not the author is accurate, certainly the philosophical sects had concerns and an interest in debating with Christians because their texts also presented a way of life, which you say that's what philosophy is about. It's about a way of life.
Absolutely. That is right. And then Christianity becomes a philosophy. And I think all those guys, like sort of Clement and Tertullian and Origen, want to present Christianity as philosophy, exactly because at that time philosophy somehow promises or is identical with a way of life. Philosophy is not an academic discipline, is not sort of an academic institution, is a way of life. And well, this is what Lucian parodies in his philosophical Lives on Sale, right? Lives on Sale. So there are different kinds of lives that the Stoic, the Epicurean, the Platonist promise to people. So Christianity is sort of an antagonistic model, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that is exactly, they want to enter the antagonism with the others and to sort of say, look, we are the only philosophy. We are the best philosophy. We are the true philosophy. But this is exactly what also, for instance, the skeptics say. Look, you are not philosophers. Why? You are dogmatists. This is not philosophy. Philosophy is being skeptical, being aporetic, not sort of having views, not really take positions. This is not philosophy. Right here, sort of Christians say, look, if you want to be a philosopher, you'd better be always right. So philosophy needs to be true at the end, right? So they somehow have their own definition of philosophy, but whatever their definition is, that they enter into the philosophical antagonism with the other philosophical schools. And by doing that, they need somehow to be serious, to produce arguments, to take positions, to engage. And in that sense, they somehow qualify as a philosophical movement.
Well, I can't think of any better way to wrap up this segment with that nice summary of Christian philosophy. Dr. Karamanolis, thank you so much for joining PatristiCast today.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me tonight. Thank you very much indeed.
And everybody stay tuned for the next episode. Until then, I will see you later.